Before we start, I have a small favour to ask. We've just launched a new channel. It's a Clips channel for our downstream interview series, and we need to get you to go and subscribe to it. Currently, we only have 50 subscribers, which is not like Downstream. Downstream is a juggernaut. It needs more than 50 subscribers. We need some more. Ash, very briefly, who are you looking forward to interviewing on Downstream soon? What clips can people look forward to?
We just did a really, really excellent interview with Jimmy the Giant, who's a YouTuber who some people in our audience might already be familiar with. We talked about how he went from what he describes as an alt-right pipeline towards the left, but we talked about so much more than that. He's just someone who is genuinely really, really curious, and you can see him sit with a question and turn it over and try and work out what he thinks. And there's an interesting lack of ego about it. He's quite happy to be wrong and to adjust his position according to new information. So super enjoyable. Just thought he was a stand-up guy and had a lot of fun.
75 is the number of subscribers that apparently Downstream Clips now has. I'm sure we can get that quite a lot higher by the end of tonight's show. Let's go on to our first big story of the evening. Pope Francis, leader of the Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88 following several weeks of illness. Born as Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires in 1936, he was elected Pope in March 2013 at the age of 76. And Pope Francis's first official trip outside Rome set the tone for his entire tenure.
A landmark crossing for Pope Francis. On his first official visit outside Rome, the pontiffs journeyed to the tiny island of Lampedusa off Sicily. Accompanied by a group of fishing boats from the island, the Pope carries a wreath to lay in the water in memory of those who've lost their lives trying to reach it.
Francis was the first Pope of Latin American origin, and that was significant because Latin America is the center of the liberation theology movement, which emerged in the Catholic Church in the 1960s as a reaction to poverty and social injustice in the region. And while previous popes took a dim view of liberation theology, it was a major influence on Pope Francis, particularly its emphasis on the Church's role in advocating for the poor and oppressed. He embraced figures associated with the movement, including its founder, Peruvian theologian and Dominican priest Gustavo Gutierrez, who had previously been treated with contempt by the Vatican's hierarchy, which saw him as a dangerous Marxist who used religion to pursue revolution. Pope Francis himself was no Marxist, but he wasn't averse to engaging in political rabble-rousing. In an echo of his early visit to Lampedusa just before he was hospitalized in February, Pope Francis directly condemned the Trump administration's deportation plans. In a letter addressed to US bishops, he warned they would deprive migrants of their inherent dignity and appeared to directly reject Vice President J.D. Vance's claims that Catholic doctrine justified such policies. During his first presidential term, Donald Trump directly responded to the Pope's criticisms of his plan to build a wall between the United States and Mexico.
If and when the Vatican is attacked by ISIS, which, as everyone knows, is ISIS's ultimate trophy, I can promise you that the Pope would have only wished and prayed that Donald Trump would have been president. Because it's true. It's true. Because this would not have happened. ISIS would have been eradicated, unlike what is happening now with our all-talk, no-action politicians. That's what's happening now. The Pope is being told that Donald Trump is not a nice person, okay? Donald Trump is a very nice person, and I am a very nice person. And I'm a very good Christian, because the Pope said something to the effect that maybe Donald Trump isn't Christian, okay? And he's questioning my faith. I was very surprised to see it, but I am a Christian, and I'm proud of it. Okay, for a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful.
I think it's one of the roles of a religious leader to say when people are and aren't sort of conforming to the faith. Anyway, he constructed a very sort of elaborate narrative there. If you criticize Donald Trump, the Vatican is going to get attacked by ISIS and then you will regret it. Anyway, let's get back to Pope Francis, who did actually meet with J.D. Vance the day before he died. Apparently, the encounter lasted only a few minutes. And a few hours later, the Pope made a final public appearance on the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. A blessing he'd written included the following. On this day, I would like all of us to hope anew and to revive our trust in others, including those who are different than ourselves or who come from distant lands, bringing unfamiliar customs, ways of life and ideas, for all of us are children of God. That's been widely interpreted as being a further rebuke of the Trump-Vance administration, though it could equally apply, to numerous leaders or even to all of us. This is very much a sort of statement that I think has wide application. Pope Francis also used his Easter blessing to draw attention to various global conflicts. Here's a section focused on the Middle East. I express my closeness to the sufferings of Christians in Palestine and Israel, and to all the Israeli people and Palestinian people. The growing climate of anti-Semitism throughout the world is worrisome, yet at the same time, I think the people of Gaza and its Christian community in particular, where the terrible conflict continues to cause death and destruction and to create a dramatic and deplorable humanitarian situation. I appeal to the warring parties, call a ceasefire, release the hostages, and come to the aid of a starving people that aspires to a future of peace. Pope Francis has taken a particular interest in the plight of Palestinians, and beginning on the 9th of October 2023, Pope Francis called Gaza's only Catholic parish on a daily basis. Reverend Gabriel Romanelli, parish priest of the Church of the Holy Family in Gaza, confirmed the calls continued even after the Pope was hospitalized. And here he is talking about those calls and the situation in Gaza in a public address.
I continue to receive very serious and painful news from Gaza. Unarmed civilians are subject to bombings and shootings, and this even happened inside the parish complex of the Holy Family, where there are no terrorists, but families, children, sick and disabled people, nuns. A mother and her daughter, Mrs. Nahida Khalil Anton, and her daughter, Samar Kamal Anton, were killed, and other people injured by IDF snipers while going to the restroom. The convent of the Sisters of Mother Teresa were damaged and their generator was hit. Some say it's terrorism, it's war. Yes, it's war, it's terrorism. This is why Scripture states that God makes wars cease. He breaks bows and breaks spears.
That was one of many times when Pope Francis condemned Israel's actions in Gaza. In his Easter blessing, Pope Francis also mentioned Ukraine, Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Western Balkans, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan and South Sudan, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region, and Myanmar, which of course recently suffered a devastating earthquake on top of the ongoing armed conflict. While the wording of the blessing was fairly uncontroversial for a religious leader, or at least nothing he said should be controversial, Pope Francis's willingness to take strong stances on global conflicts is just one reason he often attracted criticism. But he also attracted a lot of support and adulation. His progressive stances on a range of issues won him the respect of millions, if not billions, including many non-religious people, and made him particularly popular with younger Catholics. And he was forthright in his criticisms of his more conservative critics within the Catholic Church.
That is, conservative is one who clings to something and does not want to see beyond that. It is a suicidal attitude. Because one thing is to take tradition into account, to consider situations from the past, but quite another is to be closed up inside a dogmatic box.
And while this is very much a relative thing, for a pope, Pope Francis was moderately progressive on LGBT issues.
Speaking on the plane journey home from Brazil, Pope Francis has said homosexuals should not be marginalized but integrated into society. There's no problem with this orientation, he added, but he reaffirmed Catholic Church teaching that homosexual acts are a sin and condemned what he described as lobbying by gay people.
Le lobby tutti non sono buoni.
All lobbies are not good, he told reporters, but if a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge him?
Last year, the Pope did have to issue an apology to the LGBT community. At the Italian Bishops' Conference, he reportedly said that gay men should not be allowed to train for the priesthood, adding that there was already an air of fociagine, which I hope I said correctly, and which roughly translates as faggotry. I think I have a slightly different take to the mainstream on this, because I think the Vatican is really full of gay men. So I was thinking maybe this is a bit like Charlie XCX, where you're sort of such a friend of so many gay people, you're allowed to say faggotry, but who knows? Pope Francis is also recognised for his attempts to promote the role of women in the church, though it's been suggested he was less radical in this respect than on other issues.
When it comes to women in the church, certainly Francis doesn't seem to have been the progressive that he was on, say, issues of LGBT inclusion or divorced and be married Catholics. He did set up a commission to think about women's ordination and about women as deacons, but it didn't actually come to fruition. And this is one of the places where progressive Catholics have felt disappointed by Pope Francis and wish that he had pushed further and sort of more decisively in the direction of including women.
Pope Francis was also outspoken about climate change. Now, this is one tweet that is very memorable, I think, in the history of the Pope's tweets. The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. An extract from an official letter he sent to all Catholic bishops on the subject of climate change, the environment and inequality was published in The Guardian on the same day as that tweet, and it placed him towards the left of the spectrum of Guardian opinion writers, given it quite explicitly criticises capitalism. It's an anti-capitalist tract, it seems. Here's an extract. Since the market tends to promote extreme consumerism in an effort to sell its products, people can easily get caught up in a whirlwind of needless buying and spending. Compulsive consumerism is one example of how the techno-economic paradigm affects individuals. Romano Guardini had already foreseen this. The gadgets and techniques forced upon him by the patterns of machine production and of abstract planning, mass man accepts quite simply they are the forms of life itself. To either a greater or lesser degree, mass man is convinced that his conformity is both reasonable and just. This paradigm leads people to believe that they are free as long as they have the supposed freedom to consume. But those really free are the minority who wield economic and financial power. So that sounds like a Marxist critique to some degree. So can we consider Pope Francis a left-wing pope? Well, earlier today, I asked a prominent left-wing Catholic for his view. Paul Fleming is the General Secretary of Equity, which is the Performing Arts and Entertainment Union.
I'm not sure I'd accept the premise that there are left-wing or right-wing popes. Undeniably what he was a maverick who was able to express in an incredibly human and relatable way the very progressive sort of social and economic positions of the church. And that was at the heart of what his pontificate was. But it wasn't so much that he was left-wing or right-wing. The Pope was the Pope. The Pope was being a Catholic, as the expression goes. But that's the source, that was the centre of his pontificate, was the social teaching of the church. And he did it in an incredibly relatable and incredibly powerful way, particularly, it has to be said, for non-Catholics, lapsed Catholics, and for those who felt to be on the edge of the church over the last sort of 20 or 30 years. Left-wing, no, but what did he choose to articulate? The progressive social economic teachings of the church.
Are you potentially understating the extent to which the Pope gets to interpret doctrine in a particular way? And so you can have popes who interpret Christian doctrine in a more liberal way or a more conservative way or a way which is more friendly to markets and a way which is more socialistic? I mean, or do you sort of say he was just expressing Catholic values?
I would say he was expressing Catholic values, but in a very unique and new way. If you look through the three popes of my lifetime, a lot of social and economic thought comes from John Paul II, who was pontiff through the Cold War, was obviously a Polish pope, but actually was incredibly critical of capitalism and of communist systems. What was chosen to be emphasized in the West was his criticisms of communism. What was chosen to be emphasized in the East was his critiques of capitalism. Benedict was an incredibly thoughtful theologian, quite inaccessible in that way, but attempted to develop the church internally in a more, what he used to call the hermeneutic of continuity, trying to ensure that the things the church said today were rooted in the things she's always believed. Well, what Francis did was radically different. He picked up, there's no new teaching with Francis. That's one of the legacies of his pontificate, nothing new. But what he did is he said it in a way that people could access. And particularly in an age of social media, an age where people have a much different choice as to how they access this sort of information, Francis was very much a pope for that age. Did he interpret it differently? No. Did he express it in a unique way? Yes.
And you're a leader of a trade union, you're a devout Catholic, you're openly gay. Lots of people would sort of look at you and say, God, Pope Francis must have really made the church feel more welcoming to you. Would that be a sort of accurate assumption for someone to make?
I wouldn't say so, no. I mean, I'm quite, this is perhaps an idiosyncratic thing. I did contemplate a vocation to the Catholic priesthood some time ago, and that was before Francis was Pope. It would be a strange assumption to make if you know much about the Catholic Church, but I can understand why, when you look at the church from the outside, why people would feel that. And that's to do with Francis's incredibly charismatic expression of universality, his, the blessing of individuals in same-sex relationships, the way in which he preached tolerance, and the way in which he spoke about teachings of hell and sin and condemnation and the family. I think for those of us who are kind of knee-deep in the church in the first place, it is kind of unsurprising. But for people on the outside who Francis was really talking to, those are the people who it kind of made the biggest difference to, or had the most kind of cut through with, if you like.
That idea that this was sort of more significant to people outside the church. Now, you obviously know a lot more about the Catholic Church than I do, but I suppose that an impression I have, and from people I know who potentially brought up, say, in very religious Catholic schools, for example, is that if you were gay or of one of these different identities or whatever, however we want to talk about it, that sort of a Catholic environment could be a somewhat difficult place to be. You have teachings of hell for people who are in same-sex relationships or who use contraception, all of these sorts of things. So it seems to me that sort of the doctrine being expressed from someone like the Pope could have a big impact on people even inside the church, not just sort of the impression that the church is given to the outside. And I suppose, from your perspective, has there been a change in the Catholic Church when it comes to issues such as, well, LGBT rights? And if there has that come from the personality of Pope Francis, or has it just sort of come from the passage of time and society becoming more liberal?
I would say that, so again, from a Catholic point of view, it seems strange to say it because it's infamous as an institution, quite an unwieldy, literally Byzantine in parts institution that's really hard to access and very difficult to change. And so from the outside, the idea that Catholics teach something which is about the primacy of your own conscience, the ability of your own conscience to direct your own actions more than anything else, informed by the church, but not dictated to or constrained by it. And what Francis did do, and you're right, is create a space in which Catholics were able to challenge priests, or indeed other leaders or teachers or whoever who entered the space and adopted the conservative influence of the world, the material right-wingedness of the world, and say, hang on a minute, this isn't truly a very Catholic point of view. I don't think that Catholics in the United States would be as articulate at saying to J.D. Vance, your position on migrants is bad and anti-Catholic, if it hadn't have been for Francis.
Is the limit to him, though, the lack of explicit doctrinal change? I suppose what you're saying is sort of what he emphasized, the way he spoke, the way he communicated. As far as I understand, it is still very much a sin to use contraception. You can't have women priests. I mean, I know last year he sort of quite specifically, or the church specifically, released a document which was very much condemning gender reassignment surgery. When it comes to the concrete positions of the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, was the change actually quite limited and perhaps disappointing?
Limited, yes. Disappointing is a slightly different question. If you compare him to Benedict, who gets a lot of stick, but Benedict, for instance, clarifying what happens to the souls of children who aren't baptized, removing hundreds and hundreds of years of complex anachronistic teaching about whether they're in limbo, a sort of kind of half hell, is a quite dramatic change in hundreds of years of dogma. Benedict was a great theologian. You can't point to any massive shifts like that with Francis. Things like the criticism of the market lies in John Paul II. Things like protection of the environment very much lies with John Paul II. A lot of the stuff for which Francis has been the most articulate spokesperson are the legacies of his predecessors. His attempts sometimes to be more progressive have been quite ham-fisted, but have allowed the church to push a boundary and have a discussion that it wouldn't have before. A synod on the environment and the Amazon raised lots of questions about how the Catholic Church engages with indigenous communities and the injustice of imperialism. He has given a lot more roles for women within the church, although not within the priesthood, which Francis is very clear. It's not a discussion that it's not a question for debate. But actually what he's tried to do is say, well, if that is not up for debate, where do women fit? Where can we give, particularly in the West? Women are at the heart of every single local church. Why are they not at the heart of the institution of the global church? And he has, pushed that position. And there are many senior women religious and lay people who are at the heart of the Vatican now in positions that they've never held before.
Let's talk about what's going to happen next, because the sort of message I'm getting from you, the idea I'm getting from you is that basically sort of Pope Francis's legacy was more in his rhetoric than sort of concrete reforms. He created space for people to challenge conservative elements in the Catholic Church if they felt that they were sort of repressing them and their identities. Is there a possibility now of a sort of swing back to the right where the Catholic Church becomes more, I suppose, explicitly a conservative force in society, whereas Pope Francis, I think, really brought it into this much more ambiguous space? Could there be a closing down of that space when the next Pope is elected?
The Pope's a Catholic, right? That's the point. I mean, there's nobody there who isn't fundamentally on board with the core teaching of the Catholic Church. It's not a parliament or a political agenda. I mean, there's some insane stuff that's put out, particularly on American social media, about is it the conclave left wing or right wing or wherever. Some of the cardinals who have some of the most right wing opinions about the Catholic liturgy or LGBT people have the most progressive ideas about the poor, about trades unions, about migrants in particular. It's not this very simple left-right split. And if you just think how complex it is to describe a universal left and right between a European dynamic, an American dynamic, a Latin American dynamic, an African dynamic, you realize how the church is operating on a completely different set of tracks. So there's not going to be a fundamental shift. That's not what happens. There are core truths at the heart of the Catholic faith, which are unchanged since the first Easter and St. Peter and the kind of formation of the church. What will happen? There are a lot of people who are very tired of some of the... Francis was very combative within the church. I think a lot of people, no matter where they come from, are very tired of 12 years of combat. I think there is a period of pause and tranquility that people are kind of looking for. There's a very interesting kind of global dynamic that the College of Cardinals is significantly less European than it ever has been. Because the pontificate has actually been quite long, the vast bulk of people were appointed by Francis. So again, lots of these alleged conservatives who are going to radically oppose things that Francis did, they were appointed by him. I mean, it's insane to think that they weren't loyal to the church and loyal to the Pope. So there will be a shift. There will be a new Pope for the era. The Holy Spirit will determine and will guide the conclave as to who that person is. But whether it will completely shut down or eliminate the discussions that have been opened over the last 12 years, no, I don't think so. I think people's impression of what a pope is has fundamentally changed because of Francis. And that will be an interesting thing to see how the next pontiff kind of embodies the legacy of Francis in that way.
That was Paul Fleming speaking to me earlier today. As I say, General Secretary of the Equity Union. Ash, I want to bring you in on this story. Do you think sort of left-wingers, progressives around the world will come to miss Pope Francis?
I think so, but I'm always wary of imposing a secular political understanding on individuals, like the Pope, because actually their beliefs are shaped through a very different kind of intellectual history. So take the Pope's comments about capitalism and his criticisms of capitalism. Sure, there's similarities with what a lot of, left-wingers, socialists, even Marxists would say, but pay attention to what Pope Francis had to say himself. He said, look, I'm not a Marxist. I think the Marxist ideology is wrong. But many of their criticisms of capitalism, you find that in Catholic social theory. And in fact, we got there first by thousands of years. And the reason why, of course, he thinks Marxist ideology is wrong is precisely because of its godlessness. So he's understanding it through a very different kind of intellectual history. I'm sure we're going to talk about his, criticisms of Israel's war in Gaza seems like too mild a term. It was a real heartfelt condemnation and plea for peace. I think that where that comes from is, once again, Pope Francis's theology. He took his papal name from St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order. And the defining features of the Franciscan order are, number one, their work with the poor and the primacy of charity for the Franciscan order. And then the second thing is, the way in which they identified certain things that Jesus said and said, this is our centerpiece theologically. So the thing that Pope Francis took really seriously was this idea that whatever you do, it was something that Jesus said, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here, but this idea of whatever you do to the most marginalized and the most vulnerable and the most powerless in society, you do to me. And I think that was something that was very important to him. And so I think that is at the heart of many of the things that would be considered progressive or indeed left-wing. Again, don't fall into the trap of sort of imposing a secular political way of thinking on Pope Francis. You mentioned earlier that he was, more relaxed and more inclusive of gay people than many of his predecessors. But he called, gender ideology, he compared it to nuclear weapons. He thought that gender-affirming surgery was a profound sin and a crime against nature. And while he did say transgender individuals, like everyone else, should be integrated into society, nobody should be ostracized, he certainly didn't seem as relaxed about it as maybe he did same-sex relationships.
Do you buy my line that he was so relaxed about same-sex relationships and relaxed about using terms like faggotry because he was surrounded by so many gays? I mean, there's many more gays in the Vatican than there are trans people, I would imagine.
Well, look, I don't think that Pope Francis would be the first pope to be surrounded by, gay people. I mean, I think there's a long and storied history of that within the Vatican. I actually think it might be something different. And this is just a hunch and it's just a theory. Ever since, what's been known as, Vatican II, where, the Catholic Church, amended aspects of its theology and clarified certain things to bring it more in line with the modern world, there has been this question of how far does the Catholic Church go in adapting to the modern world? And my theory is this, that maybe there was a softening towards same-sex relationships. Again, he never went as far as saying it's not a sin anymore. He very much thought it was a sin, but not a crime. I wonder if the softening of tone was maybe in response to the idea, well, what you have is same-sex couples who want to form a family. And they want to form a family, they want to get married, they want to have children. These are all things which are in keeping with, the core goods of Catholicism. And maybe that's different, and maybe it's indeed better than atomization, not getting married, and choosing to remain childless. And in particular, a sort of idea of sexual promiscuity without any form of reproduction in mind. So I wonder if that explains the difference in tone when it came to the descriptors used to describe so-called gender ideology, the softening of tone around same-sex relationships.
Let's go to a clip because we've spoken about sort of the Pope and Gaza. Very impressive, I think, that he called every day to a Catholic church in Gaza right until the end, apparently. We can go to a clip from Bethlehem Reverend Munter Isaac. He spoke today to Open Democracy, Democracy Now!, about the Pope passing.
He spoke almost on a daily basis to the Church of the Holy Family in Gaza. He genuinely cared. He often even joked with them. He would pray with them, which reflect his heart of compassion. But I think his words also went beyond the standard pray for peace kind of language of many church leaders. And this is the distinction of Pope Francis, his courage, his always seeking to push things forward. He spoke, as we heard, on the war as terror, as cruelty. And I think one of the most important things he has said was in a book in which he called for investigation as to whether what Israel has committed in Gaza amounts to a genocide.
I want to go to you on this, Ash. I know you've interviewed Munter Isaac, haven't you? How sort of impressive do you think it is, sort of his approach to Gaza? Do you think there'll be sort of a push for the next pope to be a bit less outspoken? Or, I mean, I've got no idea how the internal politics of this works on an issue like Gaza, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so when it comes to the internal politics of the College of Cardinals and what are the kinds of, shall we say, more political and earthly considerations as they're casting their votes, I've got no idea. I know as much as the rest of you do who've watched Conclave, so I assume that there is a really reactionary Italian candidate who smokes a red vape, right? So I've got no idea about the current composition of the College of Cardinals. But when it comes to Pope Francis's stance against the continuation of the war in Israel, just think about all of the things that he said and done. So there's what he did behind the scenes, calling a church in Gaza every single day. There's what he said publicly, the centrality of calling for a ceasefire, particularly in what we now know to be the final days of his life. There was a nativity in Vatican City, where the model of the infant Christ was swaddled in a keffiyeh. And there was also, most interestingly to me anyway, a book published by Pope Francis earlier this year, where he said that the actions of the Israeli army should be investigated as to whether or not they constitute genocidal acts and genocide. So his position was far beyond most of the centre-left governments in the West. And that is impressive. I think it is impressive. Again, I think that this is something which comes from his theology, his sort of instinctive siding with those who are powerless, those who are on the receiving end of violence. I also think the swaddling of the model of the infant Christ in the keffiyeh is about putting Christianity and Catholicism, back at the heart of Israel and Palestine. And I think maybe breaking up this idea of Judeo-Christian on one side and, Muslim on the other. I think it was a way of breaking down that binary a bit. But yeah, it was certainly impressive. There was a bravery that Pope Francis displayed that, many politicians could learn from.
Yeah, I suppose in a way, when you're the Pope, I mean, you can kind of do what you want, can't you? Because you've got the job for life. I mean, I'm saying all power to him. But what I'm saying
infallibility.
Yeah, he's infallible.
Papal infallibility.
Yeah, that is like a kind of sick position to be in if you want to say something remotely controversial. It's like, what are you going to do? I'm the Pope. Let's go to a comment before we go to our next story. Katie B with a super chat. Thank you both for working the bank holiday. Thank you so much for watching on the bank holiday. We do it because we're committed to this organisation, which we want to grow. You know how we can make that happen. Do become a supporter at novaramedia.com/support if you are already a regular donor. Thank you so much. If not, please do consider signing up. Our traditional ask has been for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, but whatever you can afford would be ever so welcome. Thousands of people gathered in London this weekend to protest last week's Supreme Court ruling that only biological women are legally recognised as women in the Equality Act. Organisers suggested 20,000 people turned out to the protest in Parliament Square, and they held banners saying trans women are women, protect the dolls, trans rights are human rights, don't steal our rights. Lots of people putting forward that message in a very strong fashion. And one of the protesters in attendance told Reuters this.
Trans people simply just want to go about their lives and live and exist, and that is their right. There's such a tiny proportion of the population today that it's extraordinary that we've let this culture war develop to the point where that we vilify, that they're allowed to be vilified. But it's so clearly to me, it's just like that they are scapegoats, they are patsies for a wider picture for something else that is happening.
Meanwhile, there has continued to be confusion over the implications of the ruling by the Supreme Court last Wednesday. On Thursday, the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Baroness Faulkner, suggested to the BBC that trans women should now be banned from all women-only spaces in all institutions across the country. And that was discussed on Thursday's show. Since then, there has been public disagreement over that interpretation. So a senior civil servant who oversaw the drafting of the Equalities Act has said the legislation was meant to give transgender people with gender recognition certificates the same legal status as biological men or women. And a former Supreme Court judge, Lord Sumption, said this to the BBC. That's the main point, which I think has been misunderstood about this judgment. I think it's quite important to note that you are allowed to exclude trans women from these facilities, but you are not obliged to do it. So, for example, the authorities of a sport such as women's boxing, women's football, are allowed to limit it to biological women. They were not in breach of the discrimination rules of the Equality Act. But the judgment does not mean that the sporting authorities have got to limit women's boxing or women's football to biological women. Now, the ECHR, as it stands, disagrees with Lord Sumption, so there is going to be some sort of playing out of this, I suppose, in the courts or in politics as well. Well, earlier today, and to get the latest on the court ruling and its implications and the movement against it, I spoke to Steph Richards. She is the director of the trans advocacy group Translucent.
I mean, ultimately, the judgment affects trans women with a gender recognition certificate. So that's someone like me. You know, we're talking around 3% of the trans community. We're talking around 3,000 people. Many of whom's had gender affirming surgery. So the trans men would have had double mastectomies and grown beards. And trans women would have vaginas and been on HRT for, you know, obviously in some cases, decades. And it's for this community that I particularly worry about. We are aware of already suicide attempts. And that's really, really serious. So we are very, very disappointed how the judgment has been portrayed in the media. It's been grossly overplayed. I've given more interviews in the last 3 days than I probably have in the last 3 years. And often they're obviously quite hostile with all the difficult questions that you would expect. But I mean, ultimately, I think what we've got to say to the trans community is, first of all, let's keep calm. Albeit that the media is against us, most of businesses are not. We know that a lot of organisations such as Lloyds Bank, for example, Wix, are incredibly trans supportive. And we still have the right to use single-sex facilities. And obviously the service providers has got the right to stop trans people as long as it's proportionate to a legitimate aim. And so really, for the vast majority of our community, they are not affected, albeit that the hype's obviously been really, really heightened by the media. Trans people like myself, well, I can no longer sit on a public board as a woman. That's the ultimate part of it. And I find that really ironic because we're not talking about single-sex spaces at all. We are saying that I can no longer sit on a Scottish public board as a woman because that's what they've achieved.
And I mean, I think sort of politically in a way, this is one of the biggest turnarounds I can kind of remember in my lifetime. If you sort of think back to the moment in 2017 where sort of Theresa May was pushing for self-ID, where this idea that sort of trans liberation was here. And then we've gone back a number of steps now. And I think sort of the gender critical side are taking this Supreme Court verdict as a complete victory. If Baroness Faulkner, who's head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, gets her way, I mean, it essentially will be a complete victory for the gender critical side. So I suppose I wanted your thoughts on how this, I know you're sort of saying that the ruling might be more ambiguous than she's making out, or that she's maybe overreached here. But the politics, I think, has undoubtedly shifted. That's why there's no pushback from the Labour Party as to what Baroness Faulkner has said. What's your analysis of how that happened? How in such a short space of time there was just a complete volte-face in the politics of this?
Well, we can actually date to when this actually occurred. It was the 10th of April 2019, with the Liz Truss coming in as Women's and Equalities Minister, literally a few days after a visit from the Vice President of the United States to Boris Johnson, who no doubt told Boris, hey, what are you doing? We are going to have a culture war against the trans community, and let's go for it. This is by creating these campaigns against marginalised small groups, as the trans community are, as refugees are, as indeed Muslims are, we can start to get political ground. It's basically the method of othering, them and us, you know. So we blame refugees, and I say we as a country, the press, because I most certainly don't, because I stand up to racism, as a drain on the economy, on the drain of jobs. And we target trans people on the basis that we're transing kids and that we're groomers and paedophiles and mentally ill, which is exactly the same argument that was used against the gay community in the 70s and 80s. And I think the reason why we're effectively losing, in all honesty, is money. You know, we have organisations out there, I won't name them on this programme, but one far-right evangelical organisation that has offices in London, has accounts going through Companies House, that is over here to take away women's abortion rights, even contraception rights, and trans rights, and LGBT rights. And we can actually track when the whole idea started back to a valued voters summit in America of the far right organisations, together with hate groups, effectively, in splitting the tea from the LGB. And they put lots of money in it. You know, the organisation I'm talking about have declared an income in their last accounts of £1.3 million. That buys an awful lot of coverage in regards to anti-trans rhetoric.
I think it is the case that, the gender critical movement has probably been better funded. I suppose when a political movement loses, and I think there has been a political defeat for the trans movement in this decision and sort of in the reaction to it and the lack of pushback, I think, from mainstream parties. That's partly because Labour are looking at public opinion and they're saying public opinion is against trans inclusion. And I suppose looking back at the past few years, do you think that as well as being up against a strong enemy, there were some mistakes made on the side of people arguing for trans inclusion? I think potentially the combination really of self-ID, trans women are women, and there is no debate. I think those sort of free positions, which were quite widely held, sort of trans women are women, and there's no controversy, no conflict of rights, whatever sphere of life you look in, sports, prisons, whatever, to become a woman, all you have to do is say you're a woman. And by the way, if you try and debate any of these points, that's bigotry. I think that did leave potentially the trans movement in a weaker position than it otherwise could have been. And I'm not sure if there are lessons to learn from that. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I totally agree. When you come out with something like trans women are women, you've got to be able to explain that. And what it actually means is that, and your biological sex, mine is obviously female, don't match my genitals, or didn't match my genitals. I've had surgery now. You're always going to get a pushback on, you can't tell people how to think. You've got to sell it. And unfortunately, when you come out with trans women are women, And I actually identify as trans, incidentally. And I identify as trans purely on the basis that for kids, I think they've got to realise that it's okay to be trans. So I'm very happy, along with many of the trans community, to say, yeah, we're trans. But with trans women or women, that the fact that it was controversial is very difficult. You know, you can understand that women would turn around and say, well, you're erasing us. And I get that. And the no debate, again, was really, really badly put across, because what it was basically saying was, you do not debate people's identity. Everyone's got a gender identity. They might not want to admit it, but they do. And when the government or whoever turns around and say, oh, there's 5 genders, or there's 72 genders, or there's 1 billion genders, well, in actual fact, every gender, every person is their rightful belief to their inner self, to their rightful sex, potentially. So that's really what, you know, the no debate was about. But it was put over really badly. It came across as arrogant, as saying, oh no, you know, we're not going to talk to anybody. We're not going to talk to government. We're not going to talk to gender critical people. I mean, I've got gender critical friends. We don't agree on much, but we do agree on lots of other things. You might not agree on sort of biology, or whether people can change sex, or whatever. But ultimately, you do have to talk to these people. And I think it was Moshe Dayan who turned around in the Egypt Israel war, the 7 days war, was it 5 days war? Can't remember. And said, you only make peace by talking to your enemies. And I talk occasionally to gender critical people. The foot shoulders I find okay as a general, whereas the top end's very, very difficult, because they are intransigent in their views. They smell victory. They know they've got the resources to be able to deliver. They know they've got the media on their side. They've got obviously a gender critical Equality and Human Rights Commission, because the EHRC was absolutely stacked by Liz Truss, and then later Kemi Badenoch, by people of their view. So the Daily Telegraph has turned around and named Kishore Faulkner as gender critical. And then we can look back at the tweet of Kemi Badenoch, I think it was in June of last year, where she openly admitted that they had placed gender critical people in positions. And I think she turned around and said the Cass review would never have happened had not gender critical people been put in the NHS. So we have this absolutely massive battle by the fact that many government agencies and within the government itself and other influential organisations have been stacked with gender critical people. That makes it very, very difficult. We're fighting from the outside to start off with. So there are trans allies within Labour Party. You know, the Lib Dems have been really, really good. The Green Party, amazing. But we also have a division within the Labour Party now, which are gender critical. And they've got a lot of strength. And we have to realise that. So I think we've got to, when were we at the bottom? I don't know.
And that was Steph Richards speaking to me earlier today. Ash, I want to bring you in on this story. I don't think we've had you on the show since that Supreme Court ruling last Wednesday. As I say, still some ambiguity about how it will sort of play out in terms of its implications. Also a fairly large demonstration in London on Saturday. The people I know who attended said it did feel sort of really big and quite sort of energising. What's your sort of take on where we stand right now?
Well, the first thing is, I don't know about you, but I really loved that interview that you just did with Steph. And there was a generosity and a candour to what she was saying, which I just thought was really spectacular. And it's also not something that you see a lot in the media, which is a trans person being able to talk at length without being backed up against the wall, as it were. And it just made me think about how stacked the deck has been against trans people and the cause of trans rights. It's like any time a trans person is spoken to, they've got to justify any awful thing that any trans person in the world has done or been accused of, in a way that I don't think many other groups are called upon to do. In terms of where we are right now, I think that Steph put it across really well. I think that you have to look at the way in which so-called gender critical feminists, I prefer to call them trans hostile feminists, because they actually aren't that critical of gender roles, but they are, seem to me to be anyway motivated almost entirely by hostility towards trans people, and in particular trans women. Trans hostile feminists, so-called gender critical feminists, have accomplished a long march through the institutions. And I think that it's been incredibly strategic. So it's something which, was at first, very, very well represented in certain sections of the media, in particular centre-left media outlets. And then it broadened out. So I think there was a sense that, gender critical feminists, trans hostile feminists had to have decision-making power within institutions that would otherwise perhaps be more sympathetic towards or useful towards the advancement of trans rights. So something like the Equalities and Human Rights Commission was absolutely within the crosshairs. I feel like while Lord Sumption and others have said that the impact of this ruling is very small, it's all going to come down to that interpretation. And as Baroness Faulkner has said, is that and I think that as gender critical feminists argue, the implications are really wide ranging. So if you say, well, this is a women's changing room or a women's toilet, if you say, okay, well, the definition of a woman is someone who is biologically a woman, what that means is that that's what, female is on your birth certificate, then it does seem to me that, it is setting up a bigger conflict between the protections against discrimination on the basis of gender identity, which is still in the Equality Act 2010, and the judgment from the Supreme Court, which says, well, okay, only women who are, biologically female can be protected from sex discrimination, and also that's what the term women's means. So when you're saying that something is a women's space, that means it's for biological women. I do. If you are all right with indulging me a little bit, Michael, I want to talk about some of the broader issues here, because I think that I know it's not popular to say, but I think it's really important, is that the nature of biological sex is really complicated. What you first learn about it when you're a kid is simple. It's defined by your external genitalia. It then becomes more complicated. So then you learn about chromosomes, you learn about hormones, you learn about intersex conditions. And that's before you get to the idea that one may acquire a gender by changing how you present yourself, changing the hormones in your body, changing your appearance, changing, your external sexual characteristics, like whether or not you've got breasts, whether or not you've got a penis. And something that gender critical feminists say all the time is, well, fine, you can change your gender. I don't think they even really believe that. But even if they accept you can change your gender, they say, well, you can't change your sex. And sure, if I was to transition tomorrow, I would never be biologically identical to a cisgender man such as yourself. But if I change the levels of testosterone in my body, if I change the levels of, estrogen in my body, if I grow facial hair, if my muscle tone changes, if my voice changes, if I have top surgery to not have breasts anymore, if I have bottom surgery so that I have a penis, I don't think anyone would say that my biological sex is the same as a cisgender woman simply because our chromosomes are the same. So actually this question of, what is biologically female, what is biologically male, it seems really simple, but it's not. And maybe this is something which just sets me apart from, gender critical feminists, which is I can accept a level of complexity in the world around us. And I can accept that the category of woman, even if you exclude transgender women, actually includes women with, many different experiences, includes women with intersex conditions, includes women who are infertile, includes women with all sorts of experiences of their own body. It's incredibly depressing that so many people who call themselves feminists don't seem to be able to accept that.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, I sort of asked Steph if there were, mistakes made along the way. And I suppose that what you just said about biology is, I've always been really interested in that, this sort of idea that biology is actually quite complex. But I do think when I have spoken about that, I've got a lot of pushback because people don't like talking about biology. That's what I feel. I feel like saying self-ID, trans women and women, no debate. I feel like that actually didn't allow the nuanced space for some of what you're talking about there. But obviously, that's not the main story here. The main story here is that you had a very well-funded right-wing campaign, and now we've ended up in a terrible place. But I do think that, some of what you were discussing there wasn't put front and center in the campaign for trans rights, and I think that may have been a mistake. I'll let you sort of have the final word on this.
The way I understand it is that there was this question: what should the threshold be for accepting someone in their acquired gender? And whatever threshold you choose, there are problems with it. So, I mean, let's say you take chromosomes, right? Someone can't change what their chromosomes are, but they can change basically everything else about their body. So that doesn't seem to work. And then if you choose hormone levels, well, there are naturally different, hormone levels even within cisgender women or cisgender men. If you choose things to do with appearance, well, are you saying that a woman is defined by wearing a dress, a man is defined by having a beard? All of these things seem to have problems. And so I can really understand why someone would go, all right, well, we'll make self-ID, right? How you identify yourself, the threshold, because we assume that if you're transgender, you're always going to overshoot it, right? You're always going to overshoot it because that's what it means to be trans. You do want to change some things about yourself. We just don't want to dictate what those things have to be. I can really understand that. I think maybe the problem, and this might be a problem with the perception of self-ID, or maybe this was, something which people do believe, is this idea that you simply say, okay, well, as of tomorrow, I'm a man, or as of tomorrow, I'm a woman. I don't have to change anything about myself and everyone else has to accept me. I can totally understand why that, it doesn't make sense to most people's idea of gender. And I can also completely see why that is, I can see why that refusal to integrate any kind of social negotiation into it, rubs people up the wrong way. But I think that maybe, and this is perhaps a failure of communication, a failure to actually say this, I think that maybe what people meant by self-ID was that people are always going to overshoot it, and we just don't want to set rules for what that's going to be, which I can understand. Maybe not the easiest position to defend, but I can understand why you take it.
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly understandable. Let's wrap up there. Ash, it's been brilliant speaking to you this evening. 2 very significant stories.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I've got to say, I love a bit of papal intrigue. And it's very disappointing to me that you can't just have, a Medici throwing around ducats and gold coins anywhere anymore. That was the real Catholic Church, when you had a Medici or a Borgia in the Holy See.
Yeah, we didn't cover that. What is the artistic legacy of Pope Francis? Because sort of when you're looking at the Renaissance, they had a big role in all of that. Like, what does Pope Francis have to? I mean, maybe it's disrespectful to speak in this way, but maybe someone can answer that question. Maybe Pope Francis does have an artistic legacy.
There was an interesting exhibition in the Vatican museums, which I went to in January, which was about modern Catholic art, and they'd put it in the old Borgia apartments. So that was interesting. Personally, I like the Renaissance stuff. Give me a saint being impaled any day. I don't want to see a Cubist Jesus.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that was clearly the artistic peak of sort of the Catholic Church, wasn't it, when that was playing the big role in sort of the development of art. Anyway, let's wrap up there. Ash Sarkar, wonderful speaking to you this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.